A jealous ex-girlfriend, a missing marriage certificate from the crime scene, and a single bite mark on the victim's arm. This story left investigators and the community holding on to immense unanswered questions for over 2 decades. On February 24, 1986, in a quiet and peaceful neighborhood in Van Nuys, California, John Ruetten came home and found his wife lifeless on the floor. The newly married 29-year-old registered nurse had been beaten severely, shot 3 times, and bitten on the arm. What appeared to be a burglary was far more sinister. But why did it take the police so long to identify the true perpetrator of the crime? Was the case what it seemed to be? And how was the case of Sherri reopened after it had gone cold? Join us as we uncover the reality behind the headlines and peel back the layers of this tangled case. We will examine the evidence and prospective suspects, the missing marriage certificate that was taken from the home, and the mysterious bite mark left on the victim's arm. Prepare to be surprised and ultimately moved as we unravel the details of this chilling case. Sherri Rasmussen was born on February 7, 1957 in Walla Walla, Washington. She was the adored daughter of Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, as well as the sister of Teresa and Connie. She was referred to as the sunshine in the room by those around her. It was said she could make whomever she was with smile. In addition to being a stunning and vivacious woman, Sherri was also ambitious and a very hard worker. Sherri initially aspired to become a veterinarian, but later chose to become a nurse. She got a degree from Loma Linda University and was moving up quickly in her nursing career. She enrolled in college at the age of 16, and by the time she was in her late 20s, she was the nursing director at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, giving lectures and instructing workshops for other nurses. As her academic life and profession progressed, she stumbled into a happy relationship with a man named John Ruetten, whom she would later call her adored husband. John, who was born in 1959, enrolled at UCLA in 1978. He completed a mechanical engineering degree, and it was after his graduation that he met Sherri in 1984. It was love at first sight for both. People who knew the couple well claimed that John adored Sherri and that she was the type of person he had always wished to be with. Their love only grew stronger, and by November 1985 they got married and began a new chapter in their lives. The couple eventually went on and bought a house in Van Nuys, California. They both spent their free time exploring new restaurants and attending concerts. They were deeply in love, but someone in the shadows could not bear it. Back when John was a student at UCLA, he met Stephanie Lazarus, who was a political science major there at the time. Stephanie grew up in San Fernando Valley. As a child, it seemed she was always eager to impress others. In 1983, Stephanie joined the LAPD Academy, and in 1985 she became a patrol officer. Some described her as intelligent and hardworking, while others found her behavior mysterious and reclusive. Stephanie and John began dating casually. They didn't get close until after graduation. Despite having several hookups, they never formalized their relationship. John described his friendship with Stephanie as friends with benefits. That wasn't the case for Stephanie. She thought otherwise and was obsessed with John. John even claimed that Stephanie would frequently steal his clothes when he showered and would even take naked pictures of him while he slept. John, however, didn't take it seriously because to him, he was just having fun. The real turning point was when Stephanie discovered John and Sherri were dating. John told Stephanie about Sherri at his 25th birthday celebration, which she had organized for him. He admitted to having an intimate connection with Sherri. Stephanie was depressed when she found out that he was having a serious relationship with another woman. She went so far as to write a letter to John's mother in which she confessed her undying love for him and how the previous year had torn her up. Even though she was aware of John's engagement with Sherri, Stephanie begged John to come over and seek of closure. John concurred and did go see Stephanie. She begged him to return to her, but John had made up his mind and told her he was in love with Sherri. Stephanie then offered to sleep with him one last time, which John agreed to in hopes this would be the end of their chapter. What seemed like the end was only the beginning. Their marriage couldn't stop Stephanie from dropping by Sherri's workplace to let her know that things between her and John weren't over, and that if she couldn't have him, no one else could. Sherri began to confide in her parents, telling them about Stephanie's actions. She revealed to her parents how she frequently saw Stephanie standing outside in her LAPD uniform when she came out of her apartment. Sherri at times felt she was being followed. She was scared and anxious about it. Nevertheless, the fear was about to come to a terrible end. It was a loving morning on February 24, 1986. John and Sherri had been married for 3 months. Following his usual morning routine, John got out of bed and headed to work. Sherri was also scheduled to work later that day and had a motivational speech to deliver. However, she admitted to her husband that she was considering calling in sick. Despite John's encouragement to go and deliver the speech, Sherri stayed home. At 9:45 a.m., a neighbor noticed the Ruetten's garage door was open, but there was no car inside. About 15 minutes later, John made the first of many unsuccessful calls to Sherri. Her sister had attempted to contact her as well and thought it was odd she was not answering. John's stomach dropped when he contacted her workplace, and Sherri's secretary told him that she never made it into work. She wasn't returning calls, and the answering machine wasn't even turned on, so this was a cause for concern. Later that day, a maid employed by a nearby apartment complex claimed to have overheard 2 people arguing and something falling at about 12:30 p.m. When John returned home later that evening, he found the garage door wide open and pieces of broken glass all over the driveway. In addition, the BMW he gifted Sherri as an engagement gift was also gone. He knew Sherri would never leave in these circumstances without letting him know first. As John entered their home, he found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. His newlywed wife's lifeless body, covered in blood, was lying in front of him. Sherri had received 3 gunshot wounds. John couldn't believe his eyes. He immediately dialed 911. When police arrived at the crime scene, they launched an in-depth forensic investigation. The furniture was upside down, and a porcelain vase appeared to have been shattered over Sherri's head, both of which were indications of a struggle. On the wall adjacent to the panic button for the burglar alarm, there was also a bloody handprint. A terrifying scream for help that was ignored. In addition, Sherri had defensive wounds, a bite on her arm, a bruise on her face that seemed to be caused by a gun's barrel to drown out the sound. The fatal gunshots were fired through a quilt as authorities found the bloody quilt nearby. Investigators paid close attention to the bite mark on Sherri's arm and collected a sample from the wound in hopes the attacker's saliva could eventually be used to help find the killer. The LAPD concluded that Sherri was ambushed in the burglary attack after being taken by surprise. Sherri was dressed in a nightgown and underwear, making it evident that she wasn't expecting any company. Even though the maid from the adjacent unit claimed to have heard a fight, she didn't recall hearing any gunshots. She stated she didn't call the police since she believed it may have been a couple arguing. After the investigation in the apartment was concluded, police found no signs of forced entry, indicating Sherri might have let the perpetrator in. What is even more bizarre is the only thing that was missing was Sherri's and John's marriage certificate. This led to John becoming the prime suspect, but these allegations were dropped when his alibi checked out. He was at work until the evening, so there was no possible way he could have committed the crime. 10 days after the crime, police discovered the stolen vehicle 2 miles from the couple's home. It was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. This, unfortunately, provided no evidence. Authorities attempted to check for fingerprints but were unsuccessful. It seemed they were dealing with someone that knew what they were doing. They either used gloves or they wiped away the fingerprints. Police moved on to interview Sherri's father. Nels was incredibly close to Sherri. Nels grieved by his daughter's passing. But there was one thing that bothered him. He didn't believe that his daughter, who was 6 feet tall and in good physical form, could be the victim of a botched robbery. Police told Nels the shots fired at Sherri were at close range, and the use of a quilt to mute the gunshot's audible impact proved that the murder was intentional rather than accidental. Nels provided police with a name he thought was responsible for the vicious and violent attack. That name was Stephanie Lazarus. Sherri had mentioned to her father many encounters she had with Stephanie. Stephanie frequently showed up at their home unannounced. She once brought her skis to the couple's home and requested that John wax them. Despite Sherri's objections, John concurred. This made Sherri uneasy since she thought it was odd that Stephanie was wearing attractive training attire. She was uneasy since she knew about what had happened between John and Stephanie in the past. John would explain to Sherri that there was nothing left but friendship between them. A few days later, after John had left for work, Stephanie returned to their flat to pick up her things. These visits alarmed Sherri, who asked John to ask Stephanie not to stop by their home. John, however, merely stated that he was unable to change the situation and advised her not to give it any thought. Sherri thought about going to the police about the harassment, but ultimately didn't. She feared that police officials would simply laugh at her. Stephanie also visited Sherri's office, where she told her that things between her and John weren't finished. She went as far as to say that if she can't have John, no one can. Police were unable to make any arrests based on Nell's statements because there was no concrete proof of this interaction. Police simply told Nels to stop watching crime shows and neglected any allegations. Even though Nels frequently confided in police and questioned why Stephanie wasn't being investigated for his daughter's killing, the investigation seemed to focus on one of two scenarios. Either John killed his wife in a domestic dispute, or Sherri was ambushed by a couple of burglars who panicked and killed her. However, no evidence from the scene could be used to support either pretended solution. 3 months after the crime, files about the case vanished from the police station. These files included journals of the entire case and every conversation between the police and Sherri's father. There were many audio recordings of the initial round of interrogations, but none of the remaining conversations that mentioned Stephanie could be found. The primary investigator, Lyle Mayer, had the suspicion that the burglar might have been a woman because bite marks are uncommon for male aggressors. However, the case went cold. Days turned into months and months turned into years. It wasn't long before Sherri's case was put into storage. But Nels and his wife never wavered in their resolve. They offered reward money for any information about the crime, but it yielded no results. Nels fought to have the case reopened for many years. However, investigators refused to do it. The investigation didn't pick back up until DNA testing was made accessible. Nels volunteered to cover the cost of the test for the samples of blood and hair. He was repeatedly warned that without a prospective suspect, these tests wouldn't help him, but out of desperation, he persuaded the authorities that he did have a suspect. But when it was time to run the test, every piece of evidence was gone. During this time, John had moved on with his life and started a new family. It is unclear when, but at some point, he reunited with Stephanie. John called the detective and asked if there was any new evidence involving Stephanie to the crime. John himself suspected Stephanie was involved in some way, but that did not prevent him from sleeping with her from time to time. Stephanie also got married and quickly climbed the ladder in the police department. She had an impeccable reputation and became Detective of the Year 2 years in a row. In 2001, a new unit that specialized in unsolved murders stumbled on the case of Sherri. It was found among the evidence a piece of cotton that may have had the perpetrator's saliva. 2 years later, detectives sent all available evidence to the laboratory. Detectives had to wait until January of 2005 for the results due to the high demand. Among the evidence were nail fragments and blood samples. It was found they all belonged to Sherri. Investigators could not find the vial containing the evidence from the bite. After days of searching, it was discovered by a wall behind a large refrigerator as if someone hid it. After examining the sample, experts found foreign DNA from an unknown woman. The DNA was run through the FBI Combined DNA Index System database, but there was no match. A new group of detectives began looking at cold cases in 2009 since crime in Los Angeles had significantly decreased from earlier levels. When Jim Nuttall and Pete Barba reviewed the Rasmussen file, they studied previous evidence and materials left behind. Given that there was DNA from another woman found on the bite mark, they determined that the burglary scenario was not likely and they would have to retrace their steps. Knowing this, detectives believed the motives behind this crime were completely different. Then they compiled a list of all the women that could have potentially been involved in Sherri's murder. They managed to collect 5 names. Investigators considered Stephanie to be the least likely of the 5 candidates, considering her successful career in the police department. They had also read in the files that she and John had broken off all contact during the summer before the murder. 3 of the women were ruled out by their alibis, and the other, a former employee of Sherri with whom she had some disagreements, was eliminated by a DNA sample that was secretly taken. After this, Stephanie was the only suspect left. Given that Stephanie was still employed by the department and the rank she was in, Nuttall and Barba understood they would need to move slowly. Stephanie worked in the same building and in the same floor as them. When they began investigating Stephanie, they discovered that she had reported her off-duty gun as stolen 13 days after the murder. The gun was a .38 caliber revolver, the same type of gun that was used to shoot Sherri. What puzzled everyone, though, was that she reported her missing gun to Santa Monica police instead of her office. After reviewing and analyzing photos and reports from the crime scene, detectives concluded that the robbery seemed staged. The only missing item was the couple's marriage certificate, and the shooter was well educated on how the gun worked. The killer was able to wrap the gun barrel in a blanket in such a way that the neighbors did not hear a single shot. Even though a low-level, untrained thief could not possess such a skill, a trained police officer certainly could. She was then put under observation, and 2 weeks later, on May 28, 2009, her DNA was retrieved from a straw she drank through as her and her stepdaughter stopped at a cafe. Investigators got the sample and sent it to the lab. The following day, the results were ready. It was a 100% match to the DNA from the bite mark on Sherri Rasmussen. The detectives were in complete shock. It was difficult to believe that a high-ranking and respected officer was connected to the murder. Now that the detectives had proof, the only thing left was to make an arrest. They accomplished it in a very interesting way. They needed to get the person who outranked them to surrender their weapon before making an arrest. On June 5, 2009, detectives lured Stephanie in the basement where there were temporary holding cells. Detectives told Stephanie they needed the help of an experienced professional to interrogate an art theft. This was the field Stephanie specialized in. Stephanie agreed and went with them to the basement. She was instructed to hand over her pistol and then enter, which she did. As they got closer to the cells, she realized there was no suspect. Detectives gradually laid out the cards on the table and began asking her questions about Sherri's murder. Stephanie quickly declined all allegations. Detectives then announced that they had attained the killer's DNA and asked Stephanie to provide her DNA sample to compare. At this moment, Stephanie declined to provide her DNA and refused to answer any more questions without a lawyer. Stephanie was detained. She was held in the Los Angeles County Jail after being arrested. For almost 6 months, no bail hearing was held. Both parties were taken aback when Judge Robert J. Perry put the amount at $10 million in cash, more than twice what the prosecution and defense had originally sought. He claimed that because of the compelling evidence against Stephanie, she was likely to attempt to leave the country or get weapons through her husband. She denied her involvement and insisted on her innocence. The case hearings began in early 2012. Prosecutors claimed Stephanie's motive for the crime was jealousy. After being found guilty of first-degree murder, Stephanie was given a term of 25 years to life for first-degree murder and an additional 2 years for personal use of a firearm. According to a subsequent investigation, the case files implied that one or more people intentionally collaborated to conceal information that might have shown Stephanie's guilt during the first investigation. It took 23 years to solve the cold and terrifying case of Sherri Rasmussen, a tale of heartbreak, betrayal, and toxic jealousy. However, even though the investigation has been completed, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. How many people were truly involved in covering up the murder? How did Stephanie get away with murder for 23 years? Sherri's parents, Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, finally got the much-needed justice for their daughter, despite the fact that Nels had asked detectives to look at Stephanie from the very beginning. Let us know your thoughts below.